students from Grossmont College. We have some students from Cal State LA. We have homicide investigators present. We have criminalists. And we even have some people from the Mystery Writers of America Association. Welcome all. Our first speaker comes to us from Great Britain. Professor Stuart Pine is a consulting scientist and author.
Ladies and gentlemen, new concepts, new techniques. The advance of crime investigation and all its aspects is quickening. Now, this morning, I would like to deal with one particular aspect which I think will become progressively of greater importance in the field of crime, and that is the unique transferable tag. The identification of a criminal usually depends upon contingent events, such as the availability and the nature of witness statements, together with any physical evidence recovered from the scene of crime. This may include, amongst other features, fingerprints, paint, glass, blood, fibers, footwear and fabric impressions. Obviously, all such information must be refined by the professional competence of the investigator and his assistants. The ability to sort wheat from chaff is what characterizes a successful investigation. Mass of detail in a crime must neither be allowed to divert the investigator from selecting the most profitable line of inquiry, nor the scene examiner from locating any physical evidence which may be available. However, in some cases, evidence from contingent sources can be supplemented or even replaced by the adoption of investigative methods which are based on an established suspicion. Such an established suspicion can lead to the adoption of surveillance methods. In some cases, this surveillance is in the form of labor-intensive scene stakeouts. In other cases, automatic surveillance aids, video recording may be used. But where neither of these methods is practicable, the forensic scientist may be asked to prepare a distinctive transferable material, often in the form of powder or grease, which is then positioned at a selected point in the hope that transfer to the criminal will take place if the anticipated offense occurs. The successful use of these transferable materials depends upon many factors, and these include the occurrence of the anticipated offense, the transfer of the labeling material or tag to the offender, the subsequent location on a suspect, and finally, the positive identification of the tag as that used at the selected point. In practice, such transferable tags are only used occasionally, and when they are in the nature of one-off ad hoc mixtures of microscopic particles or dyes or some similar mixture. And even in those cases where such tags are employed, their use is hardly ever tested in court. However, the knowledge that they are in use may inhibit a potential offender from committing an offence, and similarly, the actual demonstration of tag to an offender himself may simply lead to a guilty plea. The appearance of a brightly fluorescent patch on the suspect's hands under ultraviolet light, or the sudden development of a purple stain on the skin are powerful influences to stimulate immediate confession. Occasionally, a police investigator may decide upon a rather more ambitious use of transferable tags. And one such example known to me involved the tagging of the control pedals of the car of a professional breaker. And the idea behind this move was to examine the scenes of subsequent breakings in the hope that one or more of these could be associated with the suspect by the identification of the tag from the suspect's car. Such an idea is potentially a productive one, although in a particular case described it was unsuccessful. But it is interesting to consider why such methods are not used more often. And perhaps one of the most potent deterrents to the method is the requirement for the police to produce convincing evidence for court. Standing alone, a transfer tag, no matter how distinctive, is open to several lines of attack in court. My client had picked up this tag under innocent circumstances from the real criminal or from something the real criminal has touched. The type of questioning, of course, applies equally to contingent transfer cases. One of my own laboratories was involved in the investigation of a murder case where the suspect and his wife, who was the victim, were arguing at a party, and the wife left early and the husband followed some time later. A few hours later, the husband reported that his wife was missing to the police, and subsequently her body was found in a derelict house. On the sole of the shoe of the husband, who was, of course, a good suspect, was found a flake of paint of a distinctive nature. The husband was charged with murder. The woman had been strangled. And he pleaded not guilty. And the transfer evidence in the form of the distinctive paint flake on the sole of the shoe of the husband was tested very severely on the basis that the detective who interviewed the husband had also visited the scene where the body was found. Thus, the reasoning was the paint flake was fixated onto the sole of his shoe, retained there until he was in the interview room, where it fell off and where the suspect put his foot on it and picked it up onto his own shoe, where it was subsequently found. You will, of course, be able to assess the worth of that scenario, but it was sufficient to cause the jury to return a not guilty plea. Informational hygiene is a problem which faces as every day. So in relation to design transfer tags, could not my client have picked up this tag under innocent circumstances from the real criminal, or from something the real criminal has touched? Or is there not a themselves have inadvertently caused the transfer because the same officers have been associated with the initial labelling and subsequently with the arrest, thereby facilitating secondary transfer? This second type of question can be refined still further to include tertiary and even subsequent transfers in scenarios limited only by the fertility of the questioner's imagination. And since one can easily imagine theoretical circumstances which, if true, would negate the evidential value of a transferred tag, then what is the value of using such tags in the first place? Well, there are answers to this question, but first we must consider the nature and the stability of the information present in a transferable tag. There are basically two sorts of tag in this respect. In one, the information is conferred by mixing together different materials which would not normally be found associated together in nature. One such example could be a mixture of oat sawdust, cornstarch, petroleum jelly, and anthracene powder. This mixture will transfer as a greasy stain which is present under ultraviolet light. Microscopic examination of the stain will reveal the presence of cornstarch and oat sawdust. Many variations of the theme are possible. But in this example, the individual who makes up the tag will be able to recognize it microscopically for what it is, although few others would recognize its significance without substantial prior knowledge. A more refined version of this type of tag is lycode powder. In this tag, uniformly sized microscopic particles, which are merely stained lycopodium spore, uniformly sized microscopic particles of different colors are mixed together in different ratios. These brightly colored particles are easily recognizable under the microscope for what they are, and they can be identified even in the presence of large amounts of adventitious contamination. In this example, however, the location of a single colored particle does not yield all the information present in the original mixture. For a single particle to do this, it must be of a nature that carries the entire information within itself, and where microscopic examination will bring the observer that A, it is a manufactured tag, and B, it has a recognizable numerical identity by which its origin may potentially be traced. But why should it be necessary to express such an identity as a number? And the answer is simply to be able to retrieve the original record from a data collection. It was not until Dalton and Henry produced their basically numerical systems of classification that fingerprints became a major source of identification evidence, although before that they had been used as hoc evidence of personal identity. The technology to manufacture such distinctively labeled particles is already available. 1 million such identical particles could occupy less than a cubic centimeter volume. Such a particle type is the daisy head particle, where identity is conferred by different colored areas within a single particle. And classification and identification is made by allocating a numerical value to each color.
Push the mic right in front of you. No.
Toward you, Stuart.
Toward you.
Okay. And classification and identification is made by allocating a numerical value to each color, such as that used in the color code for electronic components. I hasten to add that the daisy head system is not the only one which is possible. And the system itself in one of its, in fact in the most popular, can you hear me at the back? Now the microphone, I tend to shout. Now you can, I'm sure. The daisy head system is based upon the production of information linearly and then slicing it laterally. Imagine, for example, a simple twisted thread in which there are, say, 10 different threads in the twist, and they are of different colors. Sort of thing you would get if you then fuse the fibers together and cut them transversely into slices would be the appearance of figure 4 just there. The slice itself would be perhaps something of the order of 20 mu thick, and the information present would be defined by the combination of the colors present there. Divided by 2, of course, because the particle may fall either one way or the other way up. But that is a combination. And permutations, that is to say, where the different features are in a given order or in a sequence, are very much more information packed. And that is the essence of what I believe is the best daisy head variant, which is the figure 1 variant at the top left there. That is in transverse section. Figure 2 is how the fibers, how the particles are spun together Another variant is figure 3, not a very, not as useful a method as figure 2. Essentially, you see, what we're doing is to spin coloured fibres around a shaft of rather greater diameter, which is in most cases uncoloured. If you then, and remember the technology for this sort of thing is already available off the shelf. If you then fuse the outer fibres to the inner and then slice transversely, these then are the final daisy head particles. And one can imagine, I can never remember the electronic colour code, but each of the different colours has a numerical identity. Then you can place a numerical identity, a sequential numerical identity on the left-hand particle there. Again, divided by 2 because it may fall one way or the other. These particles have only been produced in an experimental situation, but we're pretty convinced that with a good deal of thought being given to the problem by working investigators and working criminalists, that the use of design transfers this will become more common. I'll leave the diagram on the board whilst I return to the text. Imagine a situation, ladies and gentlemen, where such particles as daisy-head particles are in general use by law enforcement agencies. Imagine further that a forensic scientist, a criminalist, is examining the physical residue of, say, a safe blowing. And when he's examining the residue, he locates a particle from a scene of crime which he identifies as a tag, such as the particle shown in figure 1 there. He's not used this particular tag himself, but because he recognizes it as a manufactured tag, and B, secondly, he identifies its numerical identity, he is able to associate it with a case or individual, perhaps several months previously, where it was used by another laboratory. Here, the criminal intelligence aspects of the identification are obviously useful, independently of any trial considerations. The experienced investigator will have no difficulty in imagining further scenarios involving drugs, explosives, clothing, and scenes, and many other situations. This is the first answer to the question posed earlier: what is the value of using such tags? It is because of the value they can yield in the criminal intelligence context. It would be quite practicable to produce individual lots of, say, 10 million identical particles, each particle with its numerical identity evident to the forensic scientist. Such a unique tag could be produced in a small, hermetically sealed package no bigger than the palm of the hand and used in one case only. The sealing is a matter for the exercise of great care, both to maximize the chance of relevant transfer and to minimize any chance of cross-contamination, which could complicate interpretation at a later stage. However, this, what I call information hygiene, is already part of the stock in trade of the criminalist. Perhaps the use of 10 million identical particles or thereabouts at a time in a single incident, remember all of them identical perhaps and produced like that. The use of 10 million identical particles as a tag in a single incident may give rise to the impression that many people would link tag via sequences of events such as those implicit in the court questions described earlier. Doubtless some irrelevant transfer may occur, but results from studies on the transfer of microscopic fibers suggest that such secondary or subsequent transfer is minimal. The incorporation of grease where practicable in a sample will remove the possibility of airborne contamination, although it must be recognized that the investigator may wish, in certain circumstances, actually to use airborne particles as a tagging method. Crime investigation providing of working conditions. This is the second answer to the question posed earlier. Although transfer to persons unassociated with the crime locus is theoretically possible, the matter must not be allowed to rest there. In court, the forensic scientist giving evidence on a particle transfer is fully entitled, if the circumstances warrant it, to draw a distinction between what happens in theory and what happens in the real world. This distinction he will draw based upon his expertise, experience in the field. The properties of small particles vary greatly. Some tend to carry an electrostatic charge, and they are attracted or repelled according to the electrical nature of surrounding objects, including, of course, the fibers in clothing. A great deal is already known in the field of small particles, and this is known from research carried out mainly for commercial reasons. This knowledge should now be combined with the long-established expertise of the criminalist in the field of cases, and a research program set up in the field of single particle transferable types. Each batch of particles produced should have a unique numerical identity which can be established from the examination of a single particle from that batch. Furthermore, the recovery of such particles under operational conditions to be facilitated by the incorporation into each particle of a location indicator such as an ultraviolet fluorescent agent. And in this way, a high degree of it may be exercised in choosing that material recovered from suspect or scene which is to be subjected to a microscopical search for types. So often the criminalist has a great amount of irrelevant material through which to sort for relevant evidence. This, unfortunately, is in the nature of things when one is considering contingent transfer traces, that is to say, traces which just happen to be at the scene and just happen to transfer to the criminal. In the case of design transfer types, of course, there would be no excuse for us not building into the system a method of high selectivity. One could imagine a scene being searched perhaps on the same basis as the one which I described to you earlier, when the professional breaker had his car pedals dosed with an ad hoc transferable type. One can imagine, for example, and this is not too fanciful from the criminal intelligence point of view, that an individual criminal, or his car perhaps, could be tagged in this way, and that the evidence, the transfer, could occur long afterwards and could occur at several scenes, not just one. Again, as we can see straight away, the value of this would be, I think, predominantly in the criminal intelligence field rather than in the individual case field. But it would be up to the individual criminalist and individual investigator together to design in each case the best way of applying such types. The method of producing these, which we are using currently on an experimental basis, is one using a braiding machine. These braiding machines are available off the shelf. So technology does not have to be developed for it. And I'd now like to go one step further forward, ladies and gentlemen. Originally, it was my desire to design a machine that the individual law enforcement agency, probably its laboratory, could use. Not for the particles themselves to be manufactured by an outside agency, but for the laboratory themselves to manufacture particles for a purpose, for a particular crime. The daisy-head system would make the variation of these particles very simple. One could simply change the order of the colored fibers which are spun around the central shaft. It would have the advantage that when identified by the laboratory, then would be immediately known from which unique batch the particles came. And furthermore, to repeat an example which I gave earlier on, should these systems or a system similar to this become general, it will be possible for another laboratory, another criminalistics laboratory perhaps in another state, to spot a tag as a tag, even if it is not their own. And this, I believe, will yield evidence of high value in the future, both certainly from the criminal intelligence point of view, and in many cases, I believe, from the court point of view, because once one's attention is focused on a particular suspect, then investigative resources can be concentrated in that direction, and perhaps the tag itself need not even be mentioned in court. It is merely the oil in the investigative machine. There's a great deal to be done, ladies and gentlemen, in the design of a crime investigation. We must not be, as we have been before, just a slave of circumstances. And I feel that we must recognize clearly that investigation in science, investigation in scientific research, and crime investigation have the same structure. That in fact the scientist's method of thinking, when he carries out a particular piece of such, is exactly the same as that of the investigator. The two of them together, they absorb individual pieces of information in the process known as induction. And after a while, instinctively, subjectively, it happens in science, even in mathematics, and it happens in crime investigation, a picture begins to form. And this picture, you can call it a hunch, or you can call it a hypothesis. But once you've got it, you then subject it to tests. And these tests may be experimental in the laboratory, or by setting up a particular line of inquiry in the crime investigation. And since in science we design things to make, in scientific research, to make things easier for ourselves, then why don't we do the same in crime investigation? I believe, although I am something known as something of an optimist, I believe that the future for designed transferable tags, particularly if the individual agencies, criminalistic laboratories, can produce them themselves, is very great indeed. It has the only system possible. Some of you will know, of course, of the 3M system, which has some similarities, which was produced, must be almost 10 years ago. But any of you whose interest has been stimulated by this, which is currently my only experimental topic, I would very much like to receive your suggestions, and if you wish, we may be able to send you some experimental batches of particles when they begin to come off the line. Thank you for listening to me.
Our next speaker is Skip Palaniuk. He's a senior microscopist with Crowe Associates.
Thank you very much. Oh, this slide out. Can I ask you to just straighten that up? Today has to do with something that sounds similar. Professor Kine's remarks on manufactured tags relate to what I'd like to talk about today. My whole life has been, most of my adult life anyway, has been involved in the examination of particles from a number of points of view, including those concerned with forensic science. The topic is an investigative tool, has to do with a particular interest of mine, the use of particles as tracers for obtaining information. Photograph on the screen is familiar to most of you in this room, at least the criminalist. It's a studio portrait of Edmund Lacard. It was probably the first scientist, in addition as a medical man, a critic for daily newspapers and arts. He was a violinist, and therefore came close to Sherlock Holmes in that respect. He was the first forensic scientist to show an inordinate interest in small particles, in small amounts of materials. His studies and researches, particularly on the examination of dust, although they encompassed a wide range of other materials, the examination of fingerprints, the destruction of fingerprints and their regeneration, the study of the fine fingerprint poroscopy, and documents were all studied by Lacard. Scientists came from over the entire world to work with him. These principles are remembered today for something called the exchange principle. Word Lacard, or actual principle Lacard himself never actually stated, as far as I can tell, but was given to him by the British forensic scientist Nicholl, attributed to Lacard, which forms the basis for everything I'm going to talk about today. It forms the basis for a great deal of the examination of particles, microtraces as evidence. When Lacard says, you can easily read the screen then, when two objects come in contact, there's a transfer of material. The atoms that are transferred, molecules that are transferred, but generally we're talking about materials which are detectable. It's possible that although the transfer occurs in any case, for there's examination of many different types of dust in many different circumstances, the examination of the earwax of manual laborers, beating dust and vacuuming dust from the clothing of these individuals, sweeping out pockets which have been detached, were all studied by him. But his results brought about the idea, this principle, this idea of contact tracing, material being transferred, and giving information about the location from which it originally came, and also about whether or not that ultimately two objects had been in contact. They said there are caveats to this. For example, the amount of material transferred may be so minute as to be undetectable. If you can't detect it, you can't analyze it in most cases. The rate of decay may be so great that it's difficult to get to the material soon enough to be able to detect it and then identify it and interpret those findings. Lacard's theoretical work has been proven experimentally in the 1970s, more recently by a number of studies, notably those, at least as far as pioneering studies, those of Pounds and Small in Great Britain, and with their excellent work, which has been, again, followed up by many others, on the examination of the actual mechanisms of transfer of fibers, the collection efficiencies of various types of devices for removing and collecting these materials. Trace evidence microscopy, though, is generally used in two distinctive ways, but far greater amount of work done has to do with the comparison to identify, to try and individualize small particles, small amounts of materials, fibers, hairs, and glass. This is the bread and butter of the most criminalistic sections. Used far less, for one reason, it's generally more time-consuming and doesn't always fit into the busy schedule of the crime laboratory, is the investigative role of microtraces. In this case, once again, we have to recover these materials, we have to detect them, we have to identify them by means which are generally microscopical in nature. And then finally, determine something about determine products, where did these particles come from, where could they have come from. A lot of this information is what I'd like to talk about today, and I'd certainly like to the topic of my conversation or my discussion, so it really has to do with the investigative aspects of these microtraces. To start out, I'd like to just use a couple of examples. First, with one of my mentors, Max Reiselzer. Imagine the Italian police in the late 1960s, early 1970s, locating the body in a wooded area. It was the body of a young woman, a shallow grave, no identifying information at all. No pocketbook, no letters, driver's license. No one knew who she was. She was covered in a shallow grave, covered over with a small amount of soil and vegetable debris, forest debris. Max Fry was called in to look at the evidence in the case. His detective, one of the things he's most famous for is in the early 1950s, when he's starting the Zurich police laboratory, using the idea of sticky tape. And in this particular case, just as an example of something kind of being like talking about this one. Looking through the material, this large amount of debris which had been taken from the victim, who was badly decomposed, he started picking out small bits of plant material, bits of mineral grains, and so forth. And among the things, he discovered leaves of a plant. There were leaves of a lot of plants. One of the plants really didn't seem to belong. There were leaves of a plant called arnica, which he immediately recognized, first of all, on the basis of the hairs, the trichomes. That was a clue. He had been teaching, of course, in pharmacognosy, the study of medicinal plants under the microscope. At least that's one aspect of pharmacognosy, the microscopical. And he was well aware of the microscopic morphology of these plants, and recognizing it as an arnica. That's interesting, but it doesn't belong there. If you recall, this was found in a forested area in the lowlands of Italy. So he immediately took that information, and with that key, this is one of the important points of these kinds of investigations under the microscope. It's usually something that gets you thinking in the first place. With that key, other types of plant material, tissues, and other things that he found all started fitting together. Even though they were in a decomposed state, they were pulverized, they were small in quantity. They had to be cleared off from clays and things which were irritating. This material could be identified, and its relationship in this case with the crime could be examined. From this, he built up a picture, postulated a site in which the body could have originally been in contact. And the site that he had described, the Italian police didn't have any idea, but they asked to have some idea of what his memory. He said, well, I've never been there, but there is 200 kilometers or 200 miles. I'm not sure anymore. It's been a while since this case was explained to me. There was an alpine ski village where he felt some of these things may have been found just by the geology and the altitude involved. Sure enough, they visited the site with Max Fry and located all the plants. They started showing the girl's picture around the village, and sure enough, it turns out that she had worked as a barmaid there. She had a boyfriend, requested a boyfriend. It turns out that the boyfriend had made advances that she had resisted. He was a volatile type, and the rest is a typical story from there on. The point I'm trying to make is, by establishing these small facts in the first place, other facts all intertwined, these were all microscopic in nature, though. He was able to get to the police to a point where they could then take a photograph around, and certainly then, although the body was decomposed, it had been fixed up a little bit, people did recognize the photograph of the victim. Something closer to home, although a little farther away in time. This is Edward Oscar Heinrich, Wizard of Berkeley. Heinrich was known as the wizard for a number of reasons, particularly cases like the one I'm about to describe. Many of them in California are already familiar with this case. It involved the robbery of a mail train passing through the Siskiyou Mountains on October 11, 1923. So some time ago, we're very close to the anniversary date now. As the mail train passed through a tunnel, an explosion went off, stopping the train at the mouth of the tunnel. Three men came out of down the hill, came up to the train. To make a long story short, in a few minutes, the engineer, the brakeman, and the mailroom clerk were all dead. In fact, the work that was criminals performed on the mail trucks, not like Bush Cassidy and Sundance Kid when they set off a explosive charge. In that case, it didn't blow the entire mail car apart, but it did start on fire. The mail clerk died at his post. By the time authorities arrived at the scene, the bandits who escaped with nothing, as it turns out, were long gone. But overlooking the hill was a detonator with a dry cell battery attached to a pair of greasy overalls. After 2 days of searching, the posse that had been formed was no closer to the truth than they were when they had started, no closer to the suspect. And suggest the town, because they used dry cell batteries like that down at the local garage. They went down to one of the local towns. The mechanic came out wearing greasy overalls, looked very much like the overalls that had been found at the scene of the crime. And a short while later, this mechanic working the place was arrested. But again, 2 or 3 days passed, and they got nothing from him, and the other investigations had not proceeded along very well either. So once again, they were stymied. They were stopped. They had somebody in custody, they had their greasy overalls. They still had 3 dead railroad employees in a blown-up train. The group that got together to discuss this decided to send it to that man Heinrich from Berkeley. Heinrich was called in. He searched the overalls. A couple of days later, the investigators received a report. Just summarize it briefly here. You're holding the wrong man. You should release the mechanic. The man you want is the overalls were worn by a left-handed lumberjack who's accustomed to work around fir trees. He lives and works in the Pacific Northwest. He's a white male between 21 and 25 years of age, between 5 feet 10, about 165 pounds, light brown hair, is fastidious, and you'll be hearing more from me later. The investigator says, sure. They went out to visit Heinrich, and he told them by what means he performed this magic. It wasn't all apart. First of all, he said, you sent me the greasy overalls because you thought that the grease matched that of the mechanic. Well, it turns out that's not grease, but it's pitch. In fact, it's fur pitch. I looked at the overalls. I found inside the right-hand pockets bits of fir chips. There are also bits of fir needles in there as well. And if you look at the chips, you can identify, you can see that the wood is Douglas fir. It's native to the Pacific Northwest. The fact that it was in his right-hand pocket indicated, and they were chips, so it's a kind of produced by an axe, indicated that he was a left-hand, and a right-hand lumberjack. If he's a right-hand lumberjack, he expected to receive material in his left-hand pocket, whereas the material that was exclusively in the right-hand pocket. In addition, there were business about how the belt was buckled and how the pants had obviously been tucked into lumberjacks' boots. The color of the hair he obtained from a hair which was stuck to the buttons of the overalls. The age is something that would be a little more careful of today. Heinrich says that I determined the age from the hair. Most people wouldn't. In this case, Heinrich turned out to be lucky. Sometimes luck is involved in this sorts of thing. The height and weight, again, estimated from the way that the overalls were buckled and the length between the two. But you used a combination of techniques, both microscopical, microchemical, but also commonsensical, if you want to use that word, to arrive at this conclusion. That brings up one of the big differences between the two kinds of examinations that I've talked about, these two trace evidence activities. Comparative on the one hand, where you have to be scrupulously objective about what you look at, how you interpret the data. In the investigative sense, though, the point is to identify the material as rapidly as possible and try and associate its connection with the crime. Then you're allowed to be, as long as you realize that Jason is speculative about the information, you're trying to provide the investigator with leads. Two entirely different kinds of criminalistic activities. But in this one, you're allowed a little more leeway as long as you recognize it's only for the purpose of trying to get clues, trying to provide leads to investigators. It's not the kind of material that you necessarily want to go to court with. In fact, in most cases, not, because you've taken off from the purely objective scientific point of view and gone into more speculative aspects. Anyway, those are sort of two cases, sort of picking the right frame of mind for what I'm about to talk about now. These are just some uses that I've thought of. I haven't made them up, it's things that came to mind, of microscopic trace elements. The first is the purely comparative aspect we talked about. The others are of far more interest to me. Helping to describe a subject. For example, the work that Heinrich did. Describe a site or discover a location, as Max Fry did the case in the Italian following the plant exclusively in alpine areas. To verify or refute alibi, a reconstruction, trace nothing. Most of these, though, involve, number one, the establishment of a fact, a particular fact in the case, and this holds true even for the comparative aspects of trace evidence microscopy. But second, to derive from that fact, if possible, some further information based upon the investigative experience, the criminalist experience, or with the aid of others, going to specialists in the field. Once they've identified the material, there are people who understand this kind of material, who work with these things every day, and can perhaps give information about how the material is manufactured, what kind of industries it's used in. This kind of. The principal tool for this kind of work is the microscope, and more specifically, a polarizing microscope. I show this because this has been my favorite polarizing microscope. If we move into the laboratory for a moment, we can then get some idea of the kinds. First, people tend to think of microscopes as magnifying tools, and certainly they are. A great deal of what can be learned by microscopy can be learned by examination of shape and form, morphology of these particles alone. As an example, I've chosen cellulose. There are two basic ways of using morphology before I go any further. One is that there are certain materials which can be only identified by morphology. So the cellulose materials I'm about to show all originate from different sources. Chemical analysis of any sort would only show that they're all cellulose. It may show varying amounts of other substances such as lignin and things that are also in place. The principal component of all these is cellulose. And that's what will be discovered by chemical analysis. So morphology is broken by the identification of vegetable fibers, for example, identification of pollens. In the United States, they say this is a great deal of embarrassment. The yellow rain controversy, when trichophosines were found, indicated evidence in these yellow deposits of chemical warfare. As it turned out, some microscopists finally were called in to look at these yellow deposits. They found there were pollen grains. Not only were they yellow pollen grains, there are particular types of pollen grains. All the cellular contents of the pollen grains were gone. And yet the pollen grains themselves had begun to undergo fossilization as they would buried in the soil. There's only one possibility for that, and that's that the pollen could pass the digestive tract of insects such as bees, where the pollen is, where the cellular contents are removed, resistant X9 remains. This so-called yellow rain, and if you relate back to these mass bee cleanses, we've seen these in pollution cases that occurred in the northeastern United States. People come outside, they find their cars covered with this yellow debris. Nobody's seen the bees. They blame companies, and yet when you look at it with a microscope, you see it's the same thing. The United States, in the first place, would have been a little more cautious, hopefully, in their explanation that this was a carrier of some sort for these trichophosine toxins. In any case, the second aspect of morphological analysis has to do with the fact that twins can be identical chemically, identical in all respects, but yet they'll differ in their final morphology because of manufacturing differences. If something is produced in one way, one process versus another process, something is worn one way, paint would be a good example. Some of you are familiar with work that we did for Gary Courtney on the Hillary case. In that case, one of the early clues was that spheres, that the particles Gary was looking at with paint spheres, they've been modified in a very particular way. They were drawn out the edges by capillary reaction. There's normal physics involved in that. And I told Gary that you should look for a fiber. Sure enough, when Gary looked at it, there was a fiber running down the middle of these things. And from then on, of course, the case became sort of a normal comparative. Anyway, let me take you through a little microscopic odyssey here. These are just one type of trichomes. Trichomes are simply the hairs. They're felt a leaf that feels sort of hairy. They have a wide variety of forms. In many cases, these hairs are specific to a family. They can be specific to a particular species. In some cases, they're shared between numerous species. These particular ones are for sycamore. The cases, the trichomes, little plant hairs that Max Fry found in the Italian case I was talking about, are sort of candelabra shaped. Anyway, these are cellulose. Chemical analysis will only show cellulose. Through the microscope, we can determine these came from a particular kind of plant. Plants grow in particular regions. We can sometimes get location information from this. These are fibers of cotton. Cotton, again, practically pure cellulose. They have a wide variety of features. They can be dyed, for example. And criminalists find dyed fibers all the time. You can identify them as cotton fibers in the first place by their characteristic twisted, some sort of twisted wrinkle shape. The question is, how do you identify these when the particle itself is only a small fragment between here and here? There are microscopic methods for doing that. We can tell if the cotton is raw, it's right from the plant. We can tell if the cotton has been treated with a fabric softener microchemically. We can tell if the fiber has been cross-linked or resin-coated with cotton polyester, fibers from cotton polyester shirt. We can look at fluorescence and see if it's ever been washed before, so we can tell if it's from a raw cotton source or whether or not it's been washed in detergent. I'll go a little more about that later on when we talk about other cases. These are fibers of soft coniferous tree. These are paper fibers. The microscopists can look at this and immediately tell that they're a very specific type of fiber, which are strictly called tracheas, on the presence of these called border pits along here. The microscopist, by looking at the region between these border pits, can tell what kind of tree this came from, in most cases, at least down in most cases to genus. Microscopists could also look at this and say this was chemically pulped. The reason is that the fibers in the tree are held together by a cementing substance called lignin. There are two ways of taking these fibers apart to make paper go. One is to tear them apart, which provides a great deal of nutrition to the cells because they're simply torn wherever they're weakest. The chemical, the lignin is more gently removed, and the fibers are left intact. So it's also produced by a chemical process. By microchemical staining methods, we can further determine what process was used. Was it sulfate? Was it sulfite? What's the degree of bleaching or feeding? All this can be determined microscopically and microchemically. These fibers, on the other hand, from a pulp sample, have been mechanically reduced, have been mechanically pulped. See portions of fibers here. There are some across the ray cells, ray parenchyma are present here. You see a sort of baggy cell over here. This baggy cell is called a vessel element. It tells us this originated from hardwood. So as we can identify the softwoods microscopically, we can identify the hardwoods as well, particularly the species. And since mixtures are used, it tends to make papers kind of unique. And I could cite numerous cases of that were the topic today, cases where paper fibers turned out to be useful both in document cases and in criminal investigations. In fact, there's one currently involved here in California right now where paper plating is the cellulose can be man-altered, as in this case. This is viscose ringa. It started out as cotton litters or wood fiber pulp. The cellulose has been dissolved, and it's been reprecipitated, extruded, and we have, again, very characteristic morphology, and when we identify these additional optical properties. But even this can be further modified. We can put acetic acid groups on here and make acetate sodas. And again, the differences will show up in the microscopic properties, so that trained analysts can look at these materials and derive this information from it. In many cases, you may go through your whole life and never need to know anything at all about cellulose. In other cases, the microscopist has to be widely trained. You can even look at cellulose after it's been completely destroyed, or more or less completely destroyed. This is a carbonized bit of wood, say of charcoal. This is actually an effluent from a plant, from the incinerator, from a plant that made good furniture. They burned all their sawdust and wood. You get all of the microscopic structures here, which would allow us to identify this wood, the fibers and the red breaking and so forth. This information is also used by archaeologists in the same way to determine the types of woods that grew in stands by the charcoal. We can extend our knowledge of morphology using the microscope alone, but not very far. This is a grain of zircon. The microscopist is almost rarely recognized as such, although there are a few other things you'd like to do to make sure it's actually zirconium silicate. Zircon is don't contain anything like it. So this is another zircon. This may at least suggest that zircon from before. To extend the use of the microscope, we can turn to fluorescent light. This gives us numerical data, other information. It's just, these are actually two gardens. This is a grain of the mineral apatite. It's basically a calcium phosphate mineral. Microscopists, to identify this apatite, would make use of a number of properties. One of them is this yellow stain on it. This is just color. It's called dispersion staining color, based upon the difference in refractive index between the specimen itself and the medium which is mounted. The shape of the grain gives us information about how weathered this is. Apatites are easily weathered minerals. They can disappear in a short period of time, using geological time. After we cross our polars, we get these colors that appear here, give the microscopists information about certain optical properties of the material. Microscopists can go to books, look these things up with experience, learn to recognize a lot of the common minerals and crystals and almost in sight by a few selected optical properties, which we confirm later if it's necessary by other methods, chemical and microchemical. But it does give us information about a particular source. Minerals, just like plants, occur in particular regions. Here's one more. This is a mineral kyanite. This is from a beach sand, in the case I will be talking about momentarily. Kyanite in the cross polars, still the other properties. And we get what are called interference figures. This gives us a great deal of information, helps us to classify these. This is, again, looking at all these minerals under a microscope. Another one indicates the crystal is biaxial. We use techniques such as pleiochroism. This is a grain of a mineral called glaucite soil, and actually from this region. If we rotate the polarizer of our microscope, it changes colors. And this is a characteristic of a particular grain. This is to identify the mineral, and also to a certain extent, because these clear colors are variable, helps us tie it down to a particular source. Another mineral, this is hypersine. This is of ancient volcanic origin. Polarizer in one position is green. If we rotate the polarizer, it turns red. This is also glaucite. This is of far more recent origin. But this is covered with volcanic ash. This was from the recent Mount, well, not recent now, but was recovered after the Mount St. Helens eruption. Same clear colors, green, and in this case yellow instead of red, but it's now covered by volcanic ash. This all disappears with time. But yet, this gives us information again about the origins of the samples. They're just some of the kinds of things that we term as traces. There are many, many more, but I'd like to take you to one of the ways microscopists train him or herself to look at these things. What follow are just a bunch of dust reflected over the years, and I'll show you how they reflected at the end of the slides. And just look at them. People with different occupations, people within different regions. There's a whole collection of these. This is the dust from the clothing of a barber. Got little short segments of hair. There's another field from the same thing. There are a number of materials, and a lot of this we see are skin cells, actually, since this was taken from clothing. This is from a paint shop. Bits of white paint, yellow paint, other colors. This is from a machinist's clothing. Here's a bit of brass. There's a bit of aluminum. You see the striations. There's a machine. We can examine that microchemically and also make use of techniques such as electron microscope. It's just another microscope. It uses electrons instead of photons, but it gives us elemental samples up from beryllium plates. We then end up with a spectrum shows us what elements are present. You have to be careful how you use this information. Some people think these are fingerprints of some sort. They're not. They do give additional information about the sample. It tells them about its elemental composition, its elemental makeup. These are also from machines. These are particles of bluing. As the bluing has been sprayed out of the can, they put on machine on aluminum, brass parts before they're machined. Here's another one that's actually flaked off of one of these machines, or off one of these items. This hasn't been sprayed. The other had assumed a spherical shape. We use techniques such as micro-FTIR. To look at these, we get a red spectrum. This is the spectrum of acrylic fiber. That gives us information about the organic composition, the molecular composition of these small particles, as opposed to the elemental composition. Starch. This is from a baker's clothing. These are all starch grains amongst the fibers in here. It tells a great deal. Usually, all of you will almost always have wheat starch from your kitchen, for example, cornstarch. Confectioner starch is a mixture of finely ground sugar and starch. Other unusual starches can be used for different purposes. Again, the microscopists can identify these starches, the origin of these starches, in most cases, on the basis of their morphology. Starches can be modified, most can be studied microchemically, even on single grains. It's from a welding shop, welding spheres, metal. And this construction. This is all stained with chloroglucinol. All the lignin shows up red here. And if you look at this in more detail on these fibers, you can see that there's actually a trachea of Douglas fir. So this would tell us the kind of sawdust about them. It's not fine category sawdust, but rough material, rough construction. The person who works on the rough construction of homes is the clothing it came from. When Microscopist trains himself in that way, oops, we're stuck. I've got an unusual slide in there. Just is that going to go in or not? All it really shows is a picture that came out in 1960 or so when I was originally started studying these things as a kid. I mean, I'd rather pose with the vacuum cleaner attachment that I had built to collect these things. This is these are pastels, for example. This is Napoleon, an artist who drew in pastels and other work in other media. Each of these are grains of quartz with color just on the side of these little tags of some sort. Whoops, there's the picture. That's my laboratory in about 1961 at home. There's my brother posing with my modified crevice tool and these upholstery brushes or whatever for collecting dust out of the curb. Anyway, that's what a lot of these originally come from. Microscopy then applies these. Some of the cases I would like to show you, unfortunately, I can't. All your cases in California, things I've worked on, which might be more topical like this, have a way of coming up all the time. The case is 24 years old, and the cases I worked on when I first started with Crone Associates have come up again. This is another one which I hope to tell you about. Unfortunately, it's still under appeal. This is the so-called Eye of the Terrible, John Denbian. So last year at this time I was in Jerusalem looking at this, but again, trying to provide some investigative information. What I can't show you instead, though, since I can't, this is not criminal in nature. I mean, you might say it's criminal what somebody did, but there's no. It's a civil case. They actually ask people what's wrong with this Hitler. There are a couple things. He's got a page of Xerox photocopy in front of him. His hair's parted on the wrong side. But aside from that, this jacket was obtained by a military collector actually out here a little further south in California. He paid a good deal of money for it. And we've been asked to look at these from time to time. The reason this was so valuable is because of this. It's supposed to belong to Adolf Hitler. And the fellow paid, said, a good deal of money, I won't tell you how much. But this is a label which is consistent with other labels I examined of Holter's Berlin Taylor, or Hitler's Berlin Taylor, Holter's. You see it's Adolf Hitler, it's 26 amounts, this is what it could say. Guy paid a lot of money on the base. Start examining. So, pick out the fibers. The fabric itself is the finest, good quality wool. The dyes are consistent with the material at the time. The line that you see there is viscose strand, known in Germany at that time. The threads are pure silk, pure cultivated silk with bombed fluoride. Nothing seemed to be wrong with it until we passed an ultraviolet light over this label. What you find is that the label lights up bright white. Well, the Germans actually invented optical brighteners, and they were still doing research during the war, still being doing this of various sorts at that time. So it was still possible that this had been washed sometime, or that actually Hitler had been given the best treatment, that you could still possibly have an optical brightener on some item of his clothing. When we pull those threads apart, see first of all the cotton contains the optical brightener. It's under a fluorescence microscope. Cotton readily absorbs these things that make white fluids. That's the cotton fiber. What made it really interesting is that it was not just cotton, but cotton polyester. Polyester, as most of you know, was one of the main elements. This first version was produced in 1953. It was certainly not around in 1940. Particularly not this polyester, which was this is another one of part of the jacket, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the polyester clay was actually undergone a process called false twist texturing, which imparts a polygonal cross-section, so it's even close to about 1975 or so. It's more recent than that. So that a certain person who typed in that label knew that it wasn't March of 1940 when he did it. I thought at least we might have something which can be used for archival purposes, collect some samples of the the fibers and so forth, the dyes are typical of what we're using at that time. Well, it turns out, so I was sampling this, the insignia on the arm, and that's composed of strips around individual fibers. The fibers themselves are also polyester as well, so the whole thing, as much as I can tell, is pretty much fake. Anyway, what I'm trying to make here, and using it at the same time, is that one of the principal goals of investigative microscopy is to establish facts. Microscopists don't solve crimes. The investigators here in the audience solve crimes, and occasionally microscopists and criminalists help. But what the microscopists can do for you is to try and establish facts, and that's what we did here in this case by dating. We knew a date before which this could not have existed, and yet we clearly said the date was in existence in 1940. House Committee on Assassinations called one date. There was, again, in terms of establishing facts, this is in 1979 when the House Committee on Assassinations was reinvestigating the Martin Luther King assassination. One had to do with black particles, opaque particles, found by the pathologists in the tissue sections from Dr. King's scalp. And some people had said that there was another gunman, and these particles, which had never been analyzed, were simply were ricocheted from a banister which this other gunman's bullet had hit, and that was embedded in the scalp. Under the microscope, you can see, first of all, the material is silvery in color. Under higher magnification from the particle is the one over here in this case. There were a couple of slides. Under high magnification, you can see even without any destructive testing, it was a soft metal with a very particular luster, which you can't use in court, but microscopists never recognize as some of the softer metals, probably lead. That was confirmed by the imperfections of the microtome blade, which cut the section. You can see those all faithfully reproduced in the surface of this metal particle. So after telling we thought it was lead, so we go ahead and so we have to get around, pull out the torso, pull out the money, pull out the particle. I get half the electron microscope, that gives me which rapidly identifies things, which takes a while to mount, draw a vacuum on. And I took my half and very quickly microchemically proved my own satisfaction was led by a simple microchemical test. And these are crystals of lead iodide. We mix iodide, potassium iodide with lead ions. They precipitate out these nice hexagonal crystals. Characteristic, nothing else does it. And before the microprobe results came back, or when they came back, they said, I know already. Paul told me now we got the chart, which everyone would like to present at the hearings. Okay, briefly, again, since I can't, it's difficult, as I said, to talk about criminal cases here in California. I'll just relate a couple of civil ones and then end here. In fact, worried about telling you about the Heinrich case, because I'm sure I think it's one of the cases Dwayne Dillon is probably uncovering now. He's probably going to bring that one back these days too. So even cases of 65 years ago, he's still going to Anyway, this brick is just a portion of a brick that was picked up in Argentina. The story is briefly this. A firm in Texas manufactured computers, industrial computers. This was about 1983 or so, somewhere around plus or minus. They created them in Texas, shipped to Florida. From Florida, they're shipped to Argentina. From Argentina, they were taken to the factory, opened the factory, and they didn't contain computers anymore, but bricks. Sort of cement bricks, cement blocks. The question was, where did the switch take place? My original thought on the subject was to try and look at the columns. If we watched the columns off the surface, we could immediately tell, we could probably tell if they were northern or southern hemisphere. There's enough major differentiation for that even just like myself, to at least take out some of the major families involved and see if we're talking north or south, southern hemisphere. In this particular case, they've been sitting out for 3 months. The reason we were called was the investigators hadn't gotten them. So I thought about it a little longer. Decided to gently dissolve this cementing material away. What we could possibly do is look at the aggregate from which this is composed, and we did that. The material was dissolved in dilute acids, and what we were left with after sizzling was a well-sorted sand, to fill the sand for beach. We could say with reasonable confidence that this was a beach sand, first of all. This is the point where you start wondering why I take these projects on, because there's still a long way to go. You go through some entire road. Among the things that are there, we separate out particular size ranges and by means of heavy liquids. We separate out trace minerals which occur in small quantities, in many cases indicative of the geological environment in which a sample originated. Sometimes with information about geological origin, translate that to geographic origin. In this case, we were able to do that after some trouble. These are part of these heavy minerals, so-called accessory minerals, which were obtained from that grit. Some of these sillimanite, to show you, these are hornblends. And there was zircon down here, which you all recognize now. Structured before. In any case, it turns out that at one time, the examination of heavy minerals was thought to be a good correlative tool by sedimentary petrographers and oil explorations. It's been superseded today largely by the examination of microfossils, pollens, and foraminifera. But as a result of this, sedimentary petrographers all examinations of sands, petrographic examinations, where they describe these heavy minerals in detail. And by having access to some of the older books and older reports, it's possible to, from examination of minerals that we discovered, to determine that it was very typical of a Florida beach sand. In fact, we pulled out samples from our collections. Again, very typical, not exactly the same, but typical enough to warrant saying we think, again, we speculate now, we think this originated in Florida. It's more likely from Florida than it is from the area of Texas or Argentine region. Sure enough, a couple months later, we got back another break. I don't know, this may be the first one or the second one. One of these was from the first one, this was from the second. This was a small fragment. And this came out almost exactly the same way. The only thing that changed, whoever was making this had probably changed the region slightly they were obtaining from, so the mineralogy changed slightly, but not significantly. And this is from a remote area of Miami International Airport where construction was going on. So they were able to center their examination in that region. And that was the case I just talked about. The minerals turned out to be the useful clue. In most cases, though, it's a number of things together which give a location. Since I talked about investigating things, I'll take a couple more minutes to tell you about one more. A large photographic firm on the East Coast, who I won't name, but who are situated in Rochester, since they're spent developing solutions in Colorado, and what they do is to return silver, the refinery out there, and then ship it back. This has been going on for years. They're shipped in old-fashioned milk cans on trains, unguarded. Shipment arrived back in Rochester, this on the berm. They open them up, and this whole ship, instead of being filled with silver flake inside, it's filled with sand. I mean, in all justice, occasionally one of the sand grains would find a flake of silver, but by and large, it was filled with sand. Not nearly the profitable item they thought they were getting back. The question arose, where between Rochester and Denver did this switch occur? Once again, it's one of these things which sounds real interesting, and when you actually sit down with the samples and start thinking what you're going to do, it becomes a little more thoughtful, at least. In that case, we again treated the sample as a soil. We washed off the fine material adhering to the sand grains, and went through the same kind of process we saw before, studying the heavy minerals and so forth. In this case, I was looking through this, trying to get some clue. The first clue which gets me started. All of a sudden, I ran upon a pollen grain of Artemisia. Now, unfortunately, this is not Artemisia. This is from a soil sample. This has been isolated by the same procedure. So, Artemisia is a group of materials, among which are sagebrush. There's not a lot of Artemisia east of the Mississippi. So that started making some sense. The other pollen grains, the few that were in it, there were not a great deal of pollen grains in the dry sand. There were pollen grains which washed off the surface. We're consistent with the western flora. I'm not going to try to identify all the grains as I could, but the ones that I was able to identify unequivocally were consistent with the western flora. The heavy minerals, on the other hand, showed some zircons which, while not unique, are unusual enough in my experience. I had just been examining some samples bring us sands from all over the world on our trips. I had just weeks before that had an opportunity to look at some sands brought back by a girl who was pitching down my sister-in-law. The pikes which are the same type of zone zircons in these as well. So the combination of these two things are everything that could be in that region. That starts you thinking about how the other materials have been both geological and botanical. And we said, well, we can't be certain. We believe that it's more likely the switch took place in Denver region. So they brought sand samples from the train station, from the refinery itself. And sure enough, the mineralogy of sand from the train station and the sands from the canisters, the milk cans, matched almost perfectly. But the pollens change. Several months later, the pollen forms, and that turns over rather rapidly. Decay, and also the pollen grains, which are carrying the sand, the rains wash down to the lower strata of the soil. So once again, over microscopy did try. I was going to talk about fibers as traces. This is simply the famous well in 1A, 1B fiber from the Atlanta case. I was going to show how we used a number of these bullet-shaped fibers, for example, were analyzed by the original criminalist in the case as being fibers with circular cross-section. They didn't attach any particular significance. We looked at them, found that they were bullet-shaped, very unusual, wrote some letters, found that they were actually only made by Phillips. They were only made for a period of a few years and only used in particular models of GM cars for side liners. These actually, it was a good story until recently when they started manufacturing this cross-section again. So, be careful there. And then finally, and on a happy note, when Hitler found out about the masquerade, he took it all in good nature and never laughed over it. So, thank you all for your attention. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak before you.
Kind of settling down. If any of you were back at the FBI International Homicide Seminar in June, you may have heard a member of the California Attorney General's office talking about a recent experiment that's being done in Northern California, and I'd just like to bring you up to date on it. As you may be aware, a study is being done in which they're attempting to use lawyers as experimental animals in scientific research. And just to keep you current on how that's progressing, it's working out pretty well. For one thing, they're finding that there's a plentiful supply of lawyers. There's no shortage, so that's really very helpful. And another thing that's really very much a plus is the fact that there doesn't seem to be any viable organization interested in protecting the rights of lawyers. So you don't have to worry about anti-litigationness or anything like that. And then finally, the most important thing is that there are some things that cats and mice just won't do. But that's not a problem with the lawyers. So now that I've established my credibility with you, I'd like to get into my material and tell you that I have two objectives in being here today. One is to try to illustrate to you the importance of dental evidence in crime scene investigation. And then the second is to try to show you how the criminalist can play an important role, first of all, in collecting this evidence, in preserving the evidence, and perhaps most important, in helping us to analyze the evidence. With this now, I'd like to get into the slides. And this, of course, is simply the wish you would be born. When I say that dental evidence is important, well, naturally, everybody thinks that his field is important. But really what we're talking about is we're talking about identification. And my premise is that identification is perhaps the most important part of criminal investigation, because obviously if we can identify the perpetrator of the crime, we've got the case solved. But if you think about it for just a moment, identifying the victim of the crime is nearly as important, because in most cases there has been some previous relationship between the victim of a murder, for example, and the perpetrator. Now, as you can see, the figures are changing. Back in the 1960s, the figures were as high as perhaps 80% of the cases where there was a prior relationship between the killer and the victim. In the 1980s, as we can see, that has gone down somewhat. But in the 1980s, if 45% of the cases are stranger murders, what I'm really telling you is that 55%, the majority of the cases, are still cases in which there has been a prior relationship between the victim and the person who killed them. What does that mean? That means that once you know who the victim of a murder is, you don't have too far to look. You're going to look for the husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, jealous lover, lender of money, borrower of money, etc. If you have no idea who the victim is, you've got a cold trail and a very difficult investigation. And it's also true that in cases of sexual molestation, the majority of times, there has been a prior relationship. Well, how do we use dental evidence in an investigation, and what are the things that you want to be looking for at the crime scene? Certainly, if there are any dentures in the area, either a denture on the person of the victim or a denture found loose at the scene, that can could be sticking up the denture and reading the victim's name in it. You know, that, come on now, you don't have to go to college to do that. That can really be helpful. And I wonder how many of you are aware of the fact that it is the law in the state of California that a dentist is supposed to put either the patient's name or the patient's social security number in every denture that he makes unless the patient objects. Now, frankly, that's not done in every case, but you, as people in the criminal justice system, can do your part to encourage your own dentist to just casually bring the subject up in discussion sometime and ask him if he's doing it. Encourage him to do it. It's a valuable service. And not only in the case of a murder or a major disaster, but simply because of the fact that a lot of folks lose their dentures in hospitals and convalescent facilities. Service identified. Now, this may look a little weird to you. As a matter of fact, as I look at it, it looks a little weird to me too. But another way that you can use dentures for identification, even assuming that there is no identifying name in the denture, is as follows. If you have a suspected victim, what you do is you go to the family and you ask the family if by any chance the suspected victim had a spare denture around the house, and that very frequently is the case. So what you do then is you get this duplicate denture from the suspected victim's home, bring it over to the facility, and actually we test the denture on the victim and see if it fits. And many times we can establish identification in that manner, either by using a full denture, such as you've just seen, or in this case, which is another one in which we got a spare denture. And this was a burn victim. You can see that this couldn't be the original denture, would have burned up in a hurry if the body was that badly incinerated. But the spare denture was brought in to the coroner's office, was fit in the mouth, and helped to establish identifications. Now, that can also be done with partial dentures. I have to be honest with you and tell you that this denture is not from a real case. This is one we did with the Simon & Simon show. And in the scenario which we helped to develop in that particular plot, it was similar to what could in fact happen in an actual case. This lady went to Mexico, was murdered in Mexico. The denture that was discovered down there was sent back to the family dentist back in the States, and he was able to recognize it because this was a distinctive denture. It was one that had a precision attachment. It's what's called a swing lock partial, and the dentist would also recognize it because there's a little repair in here, and he would recognize that he had repaired that particular area. When they did the show, instead of pointing to the precision attachment over here, they pointed over here someplace, and the swing lock, instead of being shown here, was shown someplace over here, but I'm probably the only one that was bothered by that. One other thing bothered me about the case is when they returned the denture, they left it at the studio gate with a note, Dr. Vale from the UCLA Medical Center will pick this up. My dean would have been mortified. I'm from the USC Medical Center. We're frequently asked if we can look at dental work and recognize its origin, if we can even tell the country it came from. Well, sometimes we can get a clue and sometimes we can't. One thing that's somewhat characteristic of dentures made in the Philippines, for example, is that they like to use clear palettes and reinforce them with metal. So occasionally it can be helpful to give some clue as to the nation of origin. Now, one of the things we need to be concerned about is finding small fragments of dental evidence. Now, we're talking, of course, about crime scene investigation. I'm going to make reference to a civil disaster, but as we well know, there are frequently criminal investigations going on in aircraft disasters as well. So the principle is quite the same. Aeromexico Flight 498, you will recall, came down in the Cerritos area. And when that plane came down, it came down at a very, very steep angle, unlike the San Diego disaster, for example, where the plane came in more horizontally. Certainly there was fragmentation in both cases, but in Cerritos the fragmentation was particularly bad. And some of the evidence we had to work with was not full bodies or full jaws, not even full, but in some cases we were looking at little fragments such as this. And the challenge was to actually work with the ultimate jigsaw puzzle, where you're taking a little piece such as that and fitting it together with the rest of the tooth, such as you see here, and then taking that segment and fitting it together with a larger segment, and eventually reconstructing jaws so that actually in this particular case, dental identification was used to identify the body of this member of the flight crew. Now just think of the task one faces when you're at a scene and within a relatively short period of time the debris is swept together and you're still trying to identify bodies and gain additional evidence. Just think of the almost hopeless task of trying to find a little tooth fragment in a disaster such as this. I'd like to give credit to Dr. Judy Such afternoon. She went out with a team of dentists and recovered small fragments of evidence, and we learned some lessons in this particular disaster. It turns out that most of the bodies that were identified by dental evidence, although many were identified by fingerprints as well, but not all of them got identified. And we think we could do better, and hopefully it's going to be a long time before there is a similar disaster, but when it occurs, we're going to have a dental team on the scene collecting evidence and not merely back at the Forensic Science Center waiting for it to come in. Certainly criminalists and anthropologists can be very helpful in this type of endeavor because you're used to looking for small items of evidence. Another example of the importance of finding small items of evidence is in a case that got some publicity recently. Some of you may have seen a rather extensive article in the Los Angeles Times 12 days ago dealing with what they refer to Cotton Club murder. And if any of you saw the story, which ran on to something like 4 pages, it dealt with one or more murders related to the production of a movie called the Cotton Club. And in this particular situation, there was a gentleman named Roy Radin, who was at that time negotiating for a piece of the action, according to the story in the Times, which allegedly was based on reports from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's investigators. Mr. Radin had come out to Beverly Hills to do some fence mending. He was involved, again, according to the Times story, with a lady named Elaine Jacobs, who may not have been a lady after all. She reportedly was involved with cocaine dealings, and they had a disagreement over the funding of this particular motion picture. Mr. Radin was very nervous about keeping his appointment on that particular day. Reportedly did get into a stretched limousine which was sent to pick him up. He was nervous enough to make arrangements to have a friend of his follow him. And again, according to the Times story, that friend was a well-known television actor who was on the Sanford and Son television series. And that gentleman, Mr. Wilson, apparently lost track of the limousine that was carrying Mr. Radin. Mr. Wilson then went to La Scala, where the dinner was to be held, and Roy Radin never showed up for that dinner, and in fact was not seen again alive. Approximately a month later, a body was found over in the Gorman area, rather rustic area, and the folks there thought maybe this was not a local inhabitant because the gentleman was found wearing a three-piece suit, including a vest. And most of the vests worn in that area are hunting vests, which is not what it is. In any event, when the body was recovered, there was reason to believe that this might in fact be the body of Mr. Radin, and he had apparently received one or more shotgun blast to the head. Now, if you're having difficulty getting oriented, that's because there's not an awful lot left of that face. I don't think it would be a very good case for visual identification. If you're really having problems, here's the neck down here and the shoulders here. I had originally understood that there was one shotgun blast involved in this case. The Times story indicates multiple gunshots to the head. In any event, they really did a job on this skull. The dental evidence, as you can see, is really quite limited. There's not an awful lot there. And this would be another example of how sometimes it's possible to make dental identification with a very small fragment of a jaw, and in fact we've made occasion one single tooth, and it might even be possible in some cases to make identification based on a single filling, if the filling has a lot of individual characteristics, such as this filling has. And so in this particular case, it was possible to identify Mr. Radin not from the dental chart. Let me emphasize to you the importance of getting complete dental records when you're trying to establish identification. And what's needed in particular is dental x-rays. Some of you in this room may have known Mr. Schwartzberg of our coroner's office, who was with us for many years, and I remember telling him, look, do me a favor. If there is any newspaper coverage of this, please ask him to mention that x-rays were used. That was on a Sunday morning that I did the identification, and so this was the newspaper story on Monday. This is just another view of the teeth, and as you can see, individual characteristics such as a small filling here, another filling that had fallen out, so there was really ample information for identification, but the x-rays were important. Mr. Schwartzberg cooperated, and this was the newspaper story. So I really couldn't complain about getting the message across. I show this thing, I thought, gee, I better not show it. They're going to think it's one of those phony headlines that you get made up for a couple of bucks, but in this case, this is just the way it came out. Let's move on to another area in which dental evidence is used, and I'd like to talk to you now about the use of dental evidence in bite mark cases, because the criminalist can be extremely helpful in the investigation of bite mark evidence. The first problem is recognizing bite marks and knowing that they can be of value. I tell you that I know for a fact that a lot of valuable bite mark evidence has been buried. And the reason I know that is because California's leading case, People versus Marks, M-A-R-X, interestingly enough, was a case in which the evidence was literally buried and the body had to be exhumed. Other cases I've been involved with are cases where the body was buried and somebody subsequently noticed bite marks in a coroner's autopsy photo and then got very interested in investigating the evidence. So literally a lot of bite mark evidence does get buried without being investigated. Now, where do we need to be looking for bite marks? Well, first of all, bite marks can occur on inert materials, such as food, for example. And you may find bite marks not only on cheese, on apples, for example, on chewing gum, but you may find bite marks as there was an outstanding case in Fresno. And we'll refer to Fresno again later. My good friend and colleague up there, Alan Benoff, has done some very nice cases. One involving a crayon in which he worked with a criminalist, and a comparison microscope was used to line up tooth striations on the crayon with similar striations on the tooth. Bite marks can also be found in soft wood. There was a case in Europe in which somebody broke into a house, came into the room through a window, and he came in teeth first, landing teeth first on the table. That must have smarted quite a bit, and left his tooth marks there. So keep your eyes open, gang. You never know where those marks are going to show up. Now, what do you do when you recognize that there are tooth marks? Well, in this particular case, there was burglarized for whatever reason, did not immediately make it known to the authorities that there was a piece of cheese with tooth marks present. In fact, it wasn't until a month later, when the cheese was already somewhat dried out, although it had been refrigerated, that he made the information available. But let's assume now that you're the criminalist, you are at the scene, and you find evidence such as this. What should you be doing? Well, first of all, you recognize it. Second of all, you do not contaminate it. You be careful not to get your fingers in the crucial areas. Why? Because you're going to be interested in saliva evidence. Somebody made a bite, they left some saliva there, and you want to do saliva swabs. Obviously, when the saliva swabs are done, you want to be careful not to destroy any of the tooth marks, and depending on the circumstances and depending on the nature of the, you might decide to defer your saliva swab. Suppose, for example, you're working with chewing gum, and the chewing gum perhaps is such a nature that you're afraid that the swabs might damage some of the tooth marks. Well, in that case, the dental evidence could be preserved first by making photographs and casts, and then getting a sample from inside the chewing gum after the gum has been cast and is no longer needed. In this particular case, I'm sure it would be safe to do the swabbing carefully before the casts were made. Certainly, before you do anything else, you want to take photographs with and without a scale so that you have that much documented. You would refrigerate the sample. Depending on who's going to do the casting, if you're going to do the casting, you would proceed, of course, if the casting is to be done by the forensic dentist, then you'll want to refrigerate the evidence. So you're going to put it in a plastic bag. The plastic bag naturally might collect moisture and encourage bacterial growth. So at least until the saliva swabbing is done, you want to stay away from that, and you use either a cardboard carton or a paper bag or something that's not going to cause any contamination. Okay, let's proceed with this particular case and follow through and see how the evidence is actually used. Once the material was brought in and we had done our photographs, and this is just another view of the cheese. We, of course, made a cast of the cheese, and then we got interested in getting a look at the suspect. Now, Robbie Denham was really quite indignant about this whole thing. Why are you even bothering me? I had nothing to do with it. I don't know anything about the burglary. I was burglarizing elsewhere. That, of course, was an unintended pun. Sorry about that, Robbie. In any event, he said he had nothing to do with it. And he did permit us to make casts of his teeth, which we then proceeded to study. And, of course, took photographs as well. Now, this is a mirror photograph. If I'm speaking to a dental audience, I turn the thing around so that you recognize that that's a lower right-hand tooth. But I figured, gosh, I'm talking to criminals. Let them have some fun. Let them figure out for themselves that is really the lower right-hand tooth that's out of line. What are the characteristics of Mr. Denham's mouth that might be helpful to us? Well, his teeth are reasonably well aligned, except for that one lateral incisor that is markedly out of position. We'll see some other characteristics in just a moment. So let's go ahead then and make a cast of his teeth, which show a tooth being out of line, the others being relatively straight. We, of course, made a cast of the other teeth as well. I'm emphasizing the lower because that's where most of the information was. Let's compare the cast of his teeth to the cast of the cheese. Now, considering the fact that Mr. Denham tells us he was nowhere in the neighborhood, it's kind of interesting that his teeth are of the same width as the corresponding markings in the cheese, that the size of his dental arch, that is to say the arc that the teeth make when they line up, is identical to the arc found in the cheese. That looks a little strange. And also, you'll notice that the cutting edges of Mr. Denham's teeth do not make a continuous line, that there are some very small spaces at the cutting edge. And those little spaces happen to correspond to sort of a trough-like mark in the cheese, or actually it's the opposite, it's the hill in the cheese, which is exactly what you would expect to find when teeth such as these would dig through cheese. You could prove that to yourself by simply scraping his teeth through clay, and you can make identical marks. So that looked a little strange. And then particularly interesting was the fact that by pure coincidence, when Mr. Denham has a tooth that's displaced, we've got a shelf here sticking out, and his tooth just happens to rest nicely on that shelf, like it was looking for a place to rest his head. The tooth just drops right onto that shelf. Also, where he's got some irregularity in the cutting edge of this tooth, there's a corresponding notch where his canine tooth is worn with a slight point in this area. That corresponds to a corresponding mark on the cheese. And of course, the uppers don't give us a lot of evidence, because when that mark was made, they'll cleave the cheese, and there was lower teeth that cut through the cheese. But the uppers are generally consistent. They fit the general arch form, and the teeth are the same size and are generally similar. So I told this to the judge at the preliminary hearing, and he said, yeah, he said, I think that's strange too. He says, I think maybe Mr. Denham better stand trial. And interestingly enough, at that point, Mr. Denham, who was confident that he was nowhere in the area, said, you know, I think I'd like to talk about plea bargaining. Tell me about this plea bargaining process. So the case was plea bargain, and the dental evidence, I think, had something to do with persuading Mr. Denham that he should change his approach. Now, there are other materials in which tooth marks can be found also. Let's talk a little bit without the video. It is not a winner. It's not a winner. Don't get discouraged. Don't think of doing anything drastic, not quite the way you hoped. There's always going to be another case, and so let's look at a case in which chewing gum was quite helpful. This is the case from my good friend Dr. Benov, and in this particular case you can see that the markings in the chewing gum are quite deep, and there are multiple markings, and that the gum does not appear to have been bent or reshaped after those markings were made. This gum, of course, was found at a crime scene, and fortuitously, there were some very distinctive features in the suspect's mouth. Now, it's not every day that you're going to have somebody walk in and smile at you and get this kind of a tin grin. What we have here is we have a bridge, and the pontic, the artificial tooth, is broken so that the facing is fractured off, and this gentleman was walking around with the banking, the metal banking exposed, and gum. Again, fortunately, the last thing that he did with the gum apparently was to press it against this particular area of his mouth, as if to say, hey guys, come and get me. Because this is a cast of the gum. And so the question in mind here was this. Was this a murder case, or did the guy die of natural causes? Depending on your definition of what's natural and what's not natural. The police felt that if the... You know, my wife is at the audience. No, you come up here and get me out of this. The police had the feeling that if the tooth marks that were found here were the victim's own tooth marks, that it was probably erotic behavior, an autoerotic death, whereas if the tooth marks belonged to somebody else, it would be very suspicious. So there we were, and in this particular case, we were able to find a correlation between the markings in various areas and the victim's teeth to lead me to the conclusion that in all probability it was the victim himself who had been biting this particular object, and with that the police closed the case. So bite marks can help to exonerate someone as well as to inculpate someone. Let's move on now to a significant area, that is bite marks on skin. Now, if you think about it for just a moment as criminalists, there are limitations to skin. Skin is flexible, it stretches, it tries to return to its original position. Also, the bite mark may not have been carefully made. The criminal is not always interested in giving us a good reproduction of his teeth. So often, you will shortly see, may not be of great value. But let's start out with a winner. This is one of the best bite marks I've seen in 22 years in forensics. And so this is what a bite mark should look like. What is your role as a criminalist? Number one, be aware of the importance of bite marks and the frequency with which they occur. There's a lot of biting going on out there, folks. Every year we see more and more bite mark cases. So any crime involving sexual activity, any crime involving an altercation, any crime involving child abuse, those are the cases where you're most likely to find bite mark evidence. How do you as a criminalist deal with it at the scene? Once again, recognize it and do not contaminate it. Do not get your hands all over it. Photograph it with and without a scale. See that a swab is taken, either take it yourself or have the forensic dentist do it. When you do the swab, that if the skin is broken, don't contaminate the swab with blood. You're not interested in knowing the victim's blood type. You want to know the blood type of the biter. So avoid any blood from the victim. Then in addition to that, you want to take a control swab from another area of the body because you want to know if the antigens that are found are surface from the victim himself, such as secretions from sweat glands, or are those findings made by the biter. And then, of course, you want to get a forensic dentist in as quickly as possible so that he can make his study and so that he can make any castings that might be appropriate for the particular case. Not every bite mark will be as good as the one you've seen. This lady has an injury on her wrist. Is it a bite mark or is it not? It is a bite mark. How do we know? Bite marks Generally, if their full bite marks are round or ovoid and good marks, they will have individual characteristics showing the individual teeth. And in this case, I can clearly see impressions of the lingual surface of two upper central incisors. That's the inside surface, the tongue surface of the two central incisors, no doubt about it, and incisal edge markings of lower teeth. And we can even see the cutting edges, the incisal edges of the upper incisors, if we look carefully up in this area. So no question about that being a bite mark, although it's not quite as good a bite mark as the previous one. Another bite mark on the body of the same victim, and you can see a general degradation of the quality of the evidence here. Is it a bite mark? Yes. The ovoid shape. The injury is generally ecchymosis, contusion, or bruise, all meaning the same thing. And we can see some individual tooth marks within the area. We don't see a lot of details of individual teeth, but certainly we can see the overall alignment of the teeth. Useful evidence. Moving downhill, where a little less evidence in each of these cases, as you can see, this is quite a recent case. No question about it being a bite mark. It not only has the round shape. If you look carefully, you can see some disturbance of tissue even down here. There's a central area of hemorrhage, which we sometimes see due to the crushing forces involved in a biting injury in individual teeth. Central incisor, lateral incisor. Close-up of the same bite mark. Another bite mark with less information, but again, clearly a bite mark. The characteristics of the two jaws coming together with the central crushing forces. Again, going downhill, child abuse case, is it a bite mark? Yes. It's not a really detailed bite mark or a very good one, but it is a bite mark. And sometimes the mere fact that there is a bite mark present can be important evidence, even if you cannot use it for comparison purposes. I want to raise, I will present as much as I can in my time that's available. So let's quickly look at a few cases involving the application of bite mark evidence. Here's a really tragic case that occurred in the San Fernando Valley in which an elderly couple made a gift of a dog, a Great Dane dog, to their children so that the newly expected baby would have someone to play with. And the story was that the police got a call from this young couple that their baby, 4 weeks of age, was dead on the bassinet. And the story was that the dog apparently had caused the injury. Police, being suspicious by nature, wanted to know from me whether that injury was in fact caused by the dog or caused by some other object or some other means. This is the youngster who made a cast of the child's skull, got the dog in after checking that bird to euthanize the dog, or whatever term might be used to euphemistically describe killing the dog, and decided it would be best to wait until that was done before we try to make casts of his teeth. We then had the opportunity to compare the cast. That was a big Great Dane, I want to tell you. We then had the opportunity to compare the cast of his teeth to the cast we had made of the surface of the child's skull, and didn't have much difficulty determining that his teeth were completely consistent with the injuries that had been caused. And who knows, the dog may have just been playing with the child, but the results, of course, were tragic. Let's look at a somewhat more recent case. This involved the death in a cocaine rock house. It was a typical case of the cocaine deal that went bad. And let's take a look at the bite mark. Now, this is a bite mark on the wrist. If you're wondering about the coin, I had not yet developed the scale that I've shown in some of the other photographs, that L-shaped scale. But we realize that it's desirable to have a circular object in the photograph because it helps you to determine whether your photograph was accurately taken. If you take the photograph at a poor angle, instead of the circle being perfectly round, it will be somewhat ovoid. It was recommended that you use a quarter, but I don't know if Heidi Walbart is in the room or not. She was assisting me that day, and between the two of us, the most we could come up with was a nickel. We've had some hard times in Los Angeles, I hope you understand. In any event, let's look at the evidence and try to read it. We know that this is the upper arch. Why can't we see the whole bite mark in one photograph? Well, simply it went around the wrist so far that you couldn't get it all in one picture, and so I had to photograph each side separately. But in the overall view, we can see that these are upper incisors. How do we know they're upper incisors? Because the two upper central are than the laterals, and that's what we've got there. That's not true in the lower arch. Are there individual characteristics to this mouth? Well, these central incisors are pretty flat across the front. In other words, a dental arch generally is sort of U-shaped, and this one, instead of forming a nice smooth U shape, is a little bit flat across the front. This tooth seems to be rotated in just slightly, and when I get the pointer off, I think you can notice that there's a little gap in between this tooth and the tooth next to it. Other characteristics, the left eye tooth, which is in this area, looks just a little bit fatter. It seems to have marked just a little bit further out than the one on the right side. This is the lower portion. We've got something blocking it just a little bit. But in any event, these are the lower teeth, and as you can see, they're quite straight. Well, I think we'll get another view of the lower teeth, a little bit of TV thing. Thank you, Jack. Now you can see the lower teeth are pretty straight across. Well, usually a suspect is reasonably cooperative.